Most welcome to 1044. I will continue with Redish, David Redish today. I thought it was nice, provoking for thinking. So we come to the second chapter of the book, The Mind in the Brain. And this chapter is called The Tale of the Thermostat. There is a little haiku to begin with. I think it's a haiku. Jet exhaust shimmers above the tarmac. I remember the strength of swans on the lake up north. Their wings stretching forward, beating back. Acceleration pushes us into our seats and we lift into the sky. Your brain is a decision-making machine, a complex but physical thing. Like any physical process, there are multiple ways in which decisions can go wrong. Being a physical being does not diminish who you are, but it can explain some of the irrational choices you make. The decision-making that you do arises from the physical processes that occur in your brain. Because your brain is a physical thing, it has vulnerabilities, what one might call failure moods in the engineering world. We see these vulnerabilities in our susceptibility to bad choices. Do you really need a new sports car? In our susceptibilities to addictions, why can't you just quit smoking those cigarettes? In our inability to control our emotions or our habits, why do you get angry about things you can't change? We would like to believe that we are rational creatures, capable of logic, always choosing what's best for us. But anyone who has observed their own decisions, or those of their friends, will recognize this is simply not correct. We are very complex decision-making machines, and sometimes those decision-making processes perplex us. Understanding how the brain makes decisions will help us understand ourselves. To understand those vulnerabilities, we need to understand the mechanisms of decision-making in our brains. Today we are all familiar with complex machines, even complex machines that make decisions. The simplest machine that makes a decision is the thermostat. When the house is too hot, the thermostat turns on the air conditioning to cool it down. And when the house is too cold, the thermostat turns on the furnace to heat it up. This process is called negative feedback. The thermostat's actions are inversely related to the difference between the temperature of the room and the temperature you like to be set, the set point it's called. But is the process really so simple? Taking the decision-making process of the thermostat apart suggests that even the simple decision-making process of the thermostat is not so simple. But something as I, as an engineer, recognize. I think it was a whole term. We're just trying to understand this. The thermostat has three key components of decision making that we will come back again and again to in this book. First, it perceives the world. The thermostat has a sensor that detects the temperature. Second, it determines what needs to be done. It compares that sensor to the set point and needs to increase the temperature because it is too cold, needs to decrease the temperature because it's too hot, or doesn't need to do anything because the temperature is just right. Finally, it takes an action. It turns on either the furnace or the air conditioning. In the artificial intelligence literature, there was an argument through much of the 1980s about whether a thermostat could have a belief. Fundamentally, a belief is a potentially incorrect representation about the world. Clearly, a working thermostat requires a representation of the target temperature in order to take actions reflecting the temperature of the outside world. But can we really say that the thermostat recognizes that temperature of the outside world? The key to answering the question is that the thermostat does not take actions based on the temperature of the world, but rather on its internal representation of the temperature of the world. Notice that the internal representation might differ from the real temperature of the room. If the sensor is wrong, the thermostat could believe the room is warmer or cooler than it really is and take the wrong action. Well, I guess you're all familiar with a non-working thermostat in your homes. Could either go too cold or too warm, or it could also be inconsistent, which is slightly less rare, but with the newer thermostats that's becoming more and more important or frequent. One of the key points in this book is that knowing how the brain works allows us a better representation, or perception rather, of what happens when something goes wrong. I live in Minnesota, that is David Redish. In the middle of winter it can get very cold outside. Imagine you wake up one morning to find your bedroom is too cold. Something is wrong. But simply saying that the thermostat is broken won't help you fix the problem. We need to identify the problem, to diagnose it, if you will. Maybe something is wrong with the thermostat's perception. Perhaps the sensor is broken and is perceiving the wrong temperature. In this case, the thermostat could think that the house is fine, even though it's too cold. Notice the importance of belief here. The difference between the thermostat's internal representation and the actual temperature can have a big impact on how well the thermostat makes its decision. Maybe the set point is set to the wrong temperature. This means that the thermostat is working properly. It has correctly moved the temperature of your house to the set point, but that is not what you wanted. Or maybe there is something wrong with the actions available to the thermostat. If the furnace is broken, the thermostat may be sending the signal saying, heat the house, but the house would not be heating correctly. Each of these problems require a different solution, just as there are many potential reasons why your bedroom is too cold, and knowing how a thermostat works is critical to understanding how to fix it. When smokers say they really want to quit smoking but can't, we need to know where each individual decision-making process has gone wrong, or we won't be able to help. Before we can identify where the decision-making process has broken down, we're going to need to understand how the different parts of the brain work together to make decisions. Many readers will object at this point that people are much more complicated than thermostats, and we are. Many readers will then conclude that people are not machines. Back when negative feedback like a thermostat was the most complicated machine mechanism that made decisions, it was easy to dismiss negative feedback as too simple a model for understanding people. However, as we will see later in the book, we now know of much more complicated mechanisms that can make decisions. Are these more complicated mechanisms capable of explaining human decisions making? In parentheses, I will argue that they are. This leaves some difficult questions. One, can we be machines and still be conscious? Or can we be machines and still be humans? The concept of conscious machines making decisions pervades modern science fiction, including the droids C-3PO and R2-D2 in Star Wars, the android Data of Star Trek The Next Generation, the desperate replicants of Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, and the emotionally troubled Cylons of the Battlestar Galactica. Star Trek The Next Generation spent an entire episode, The Measure of Man, obviously taken from Homo Mensura, on the question how the fact that Data was a machine affected his ability to decide for himself whether or not to allow himself to be disassembled. In the episode, the judge concludes that the trial with a speech that directly addresses the question, is Data a machine? Yes. Is it the property of Starfleet? No. We have all been dancing around the basic issue. Does Data have a soul? I don't know that he has. I don't know that I have. But I have got to give him the freedom to explore that question himself. It is the ruling of this court that Lieutenant Commander Data has the freedom to choose. We will examine the complex questions of self and consciousness in detail at the end of the book, after we have discussed the mechanisms for decision making. In the interim, I aim to convince you that we can understand the mechanisms of our decisions-making process without losing the freedom to choose. I don't want you to take the actual process of the thermostat as the key to the story here, any more than we would take jet planes as a good models of how swans fly. And yet, both planes and swans fly through physical forces generated by the flow of air over the specially shaped wings. Even though bird wings are bone, muscle and feathers, while airplane wings are metal, both birds and planes lift is generated by the airflow over the wings, and airflow is generated by the speed through the air. If we understand what enables a 30-ton airplane to fly, we will have a better understanding of how a 30-pound swan can fly. Even though the forward push through the air is generated differently, both birds and planes fly through physical interactions with the air. We will use analogous methods of understanding decision-making processes to identify and fix problems in thermostats and in ourselves, because both use identifiable computational decision-making processes. A very good way to identify where a system, like a thermostat, has broken down is a process called differential diagnosis, as in, what are the questions that will differentiate the possible diagnosis? My favorite example of this is the show Car Talk on National Public Radio, in which a pair of MI-trained auto mechanics, Tom and Ray Magliozzi, diagnose car troubles. When a caller calls in with a problem, the first thing they discuss are the basic of the problems. Anyone who has actually listened to Car Talk will know that the first thing Tom and Ray discusses is the person's name. A typical call might start with a caller providing a description of the problem. I hear a nasty sound when I'm driving, and then Tom and Ray will get down to business. They'll ask questions about the sound. What is the sound? Where is it coming from? Does it get faster as you go faster? Does it still happen when the engine is on but the car is not moving? Each question limits the set of possible problems. By asking the right series of questions, one can progressively work one's way to identifying what's wrong with the car. If we could organize these questions into a series of rules, then we could write a computer program to solve our car problems. In the 1980s, the field of artificial intelligence developed expert systems that codified how to arrange these sorts of question and answer rules to perform differential diagnosis. At the time, expert systems were hailed as the answer to intelligence. They could make decisions as well as or better than experts. But it turns out that most humans don't make decisions using differential diagnosis. In a lot of fields, including, for example, medicine, a large part of the training entails trying to teach people to make decisions by these highly rational rules. However, just because it is hard for the people to make decisions based by rule-based differential diagnosis does not mean that the expert systems developed by artificial intelligence were not getting the real question of what it means to be intelligent. Long before it was known that humans didn't work this way, people felt that we understood how an expert system works, and thus they could not be intelligent. A classmate in college once said to me that we would never develop an artificial intelligence. Instead, we will recognize that humans are not intelligent. One goal of this book is to argue that we can recognize the mechanisms of human decision making without losing our sense of wonder at the marvel that is human intelligence. Some readers will complain that people are not machines. They have goals, they have plans, they have personalities. Because we are social creatures and much of our intelligence is dedicated to understanding each other, we have a tendency to attribute agency to any object that behaves in a complex manner. Many of my friends name their cars and talk about the personality of their cars. My son named our new GPS navigation system Dot. When asked why he named the GPS, he said, "We can complain to her when she gets lost. Darn you, Dot." Very tough way to say. A GPS navigator has goals. These goals we programmed in, but they are goals nonetheless. Dot's internal computer uses the knowledge of maps and her calculations of the current location to make plans to achieve those goals. You can even tell Dot whether you prefer the plans to include more highways or more backcountry scenic roads. If Dot were pre-wired to prefer highways or backcountry scenic roads, we would say that she has a clear personality. In fact, I wish I had some of Dot's personality. When we miss an exit, Dot doesn't complain or curse. She just says, recalculating, and plans a new route to her goal. The claim that computers can have goals and that differences in how they reach those goals reflects their personality suggests that goals and plans are simple to construct, and that personality is simply a difference in underlying behavioral variables and preferences. We explain complex machines by thinking they're like people. Is it fair to turn that on its head and explain people as complex machines? In this book, I'm going to argue that the answer to this question is yes. Your brain is a decision-making machine, albeit a very complex one. You are that decision-making machine. This does not mean you're not conscious. This does not mean you're not you, but it can explain some of the irrational things that you do. Understanding how the human decision-making system works has enormous implications for understanding who we are, what we do, and why we do what we do. Scientists study brains, they study decision-making, and they study machines. By bringing these three things together, we begin to get a sense of ourselves. In this book, I'll discuss what we know about how our brain works and what we know about how to make decisions. And what we know about how that decision-making machine can break down under certain conditions to explain irrationality, impulsivity, and even addiction. And I think this is one of the reasons this book could be very valuable in the investigation we've been holding the last 1,000 lectures. And that is the really important why question. The why question is to what goal? And decision making is just that. And in this part, neurology and science of cognition is incredibly different to all other subjects within the educational sphere, with the might possible exception of Martin Heidegger, Derrida, and Arkady Plotnitsky and some others. But otherwise, the why question never ever enters into the discourse. It's a complete non-question, and if you were to pose it, no one would really understand what it means. But I would say this is the key to understand what knowledge is and why we no longer seem to be wanting even to have knowledge, but or as well, of course, not being interested in gaining knowledge and made knowledge inaccessible or flat, so to speak. I'll continue a little bit on chapter 3 here. The definition of value. Another haiku. Diamond stars in a circle of gold. Declare your love with 2 months' salary. Value measures how much one is willing to pay, trade, or work for a reward, or to work to avoid a punishment. Value is not intrinsic to an object, but must be calculated anew each time. This produces inconsistencies in which different ways of measuring value can produce different orderings of one's preferences. What is value? What does it mean to value something? In psychological theories, value is thought of as that which reduces needs or which alleviates negative prospects. When you are hungry, food has value. When you are thirsty, water has value. Pain, sickness, and negative situation that must be alleviated for survival. In economics, the concept of revealed preferences says that we value the things we choose and make decisions to maximize value. Although this is a circular definition, we will use it later to help us understand how the decision-making processes operates. In the robotics and computer simulation worlds, where many of the mechanisms that we will look at later have been worked out, values is simply a number R for reward or R minus for punishment. The robotics and computer science model simply try to maximize R or minimize minus R. In many experiments that study decision making, value is measured in terms of money, but of course money has true value only in terms of what it can buy. Economists will often tell us that money is an agreed upon fiction. I am willing to sell you an apple for a green piece of paper that we both agree is worth $1, because I'm confident that I can use the paper later to buy something that I want. The statement that money is valuable only in terms of what it can buy is not entirely true. Either money can also have a value as a symbol of what it implies for our place in the social network. This is one reason why extremely well-paid professional athletes fight for an extra dollar on their multi-million-dollar salaries. They want to be known as the best-paid wide receiver, because that identification carries social value. Money and value are complex concepts that interact in difficult ways. Part of the problem is that you cannot just ask people, how much do you value this thing? We don't have units to measure it in. Instead, value is usually measured in what people would trade for something and in the decision they make. This is the concept called revealed preferences. By examining your decisions, we can decide what you value. Theoretically, this is a very simple one. One asks, how much will you pay for this coffee mug? The price you'll pay is the value of the coffee mug. If we measure things at the same time, in the same experiment, we shouldn't have to worry about inflation or changes in the value of the money itself. The problem is that people are inconsistent in their decisions. In a famous experiment, Daniel Kahneman and his colleagues Jack Knetch and Richard Thaler divided the subjects into two groups. One group was asked how much money they would be paid for $6 in the 1990s. What would they pay for a $6 Cornell University coffee mug? And the other group were first given the coffee mug and then asked how much money they would accept for the mug. The first group were willing to pay much less on an average, $3. Then the second group were willing to accept for it, $7. This is called the endowment effect and is a preference for things you already own. Simply phrasing decisions in terms of wins or losses changes what people choose. The interesting thing about this is that even once one is shown the irrationality, it still feels right. This effect was first found by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Incidentally, I had to tell you that Amos Tversky is actually the husband of Barbara Tversky, and of course Kahneman we remember from the two thinking models, S1 and S2. Who made this discovery sitting in a coffee shop in Israel, asking themselves what they would do in certain situations? When they found themselves making irrational decisions, they took their question to the students in the college classes and measured quantitatively what proportion made each decision in each condition. In the classical case from the 1981 paper published in the journal Science, cite here, imagine that the US is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. Two alternative programs to combat the disease has been proposed. Assume that the exact scientific estimate of the consequences of the programs are as follows. Problem 1. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If program B is adopted, then there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and 2/3 probability that no people will be saved. Which of the two programs would you favor? Problem 2. If a program C is adopted, 400 people would die. If program D is adopted, there is 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and 2/3 probability that 600 people would die. Which of these two programs would you favor? End of quote. And I had to add in parentheses, it's quite interesting. Sometime after this we have the coronavirus, so it made real sense. A careful reading of these two conditions shows that program C is identical to program A, while program D is identical to program B. Yet 72% of the first group choose program A and 28% choose program B, while only 22% of the second group choose program C and 78% choose program D. What? Kahneman and Tversky interpret this as implying that we are more sensitive to losses than to gains. We would rather risk not gaining something than we would risk losing something. This is clearly a part of the story, but I will argue that there is a deeper issue here. I will argue that value is something that we calculate each time, and that the calculation process doesn't always come up with the same rational answer. Let's get into definitions of value in these illogical value calculations. The most interesting thing about these results, of which there are many, is that even when they are illogical, like the disease example above, they often still sound right. There are other examples there where we can see that decisions are irrational and don't sound right when they are pointed out to us, but which humans definitely show when tested. The best example of most of these come from the advertising and marketing worlds. A person goes into an electronics store to buy a television and finds 3 televisions on sale, one for $100, one for $200, and one for $300. Imagine that the 3 televisions have different features, such that these are reasonably prices for these 3 TVs. People are much more likely to buy the 200 TV than either of the 2. If in contrast the person goes into the store and finds 3 televisions on sale, the same 200 TV, the same 300 TV, and now a fancier $400 TV, the person is more likely to buy the $300 TV. In the first case, the person is saying that the $200 TV is better deal than the $300 one. But in the second case, the person is saying that the $300 TV is the better deal. Even though we've been offered the same televisions for the same price, the decision changes depending on whether there is a $100 TV or a $400 TV in the mix. This is called Extremeness Aversion, and it is a component of a more general process called framing. In short, the set of available options changes when your valuation of these options changes your valuations of these options. This is the completely irrational and, unlike other examples above, seems unreasonable, at least to me, yet in some of the most reliable results in marketing, and has probably been used since the first markets in ancient times through to the modern digital age. Value is, oddly enough, almost the same as Sorge, I would say. Sorge and Dinge. All these things that are mentioned by Redish are things coming from Heidegger, because they are in practical use, and these terms are not terms that Redish have found in normal language. No, they're made up to point to something that we don't usually speak about, and therefore we have no tradition speaking about these things, and what we don't know will hinder us, would block things. And I would say both what we know, or what we think we know, and what we don't know will put extreme limits on our power to understand, to project, and to be. And this has a lot to do with knowledge as well. And I would say knowledge and value is almost the same thing here. Erkenntnis, to really know something, is to know value. And for that you need to constantly recalculate, as it's called here in Redish. I think Heidegger would call it something completely different. But think about it this way. If this list with correctness is not valid, what do we have instead? Because we can, and some people do, extremely good decisions, and they have extremely good knowledge, and they have a perception that is beyond belief. They understand, they take in much more than ordinary man. So it is possible. So how to understand that person to further our own understanding, to help us get higher up, to expand knowledge-wise. This is what this is pointing to. And therefore, I'm afraid we need neologisms. Nothing else would get us to the why question. And that is something I'm quite certain of. I think I need a drink now. But thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. This lovely spot. I can get some of the